He's been called the Oracle of Omaha, the Sage of Nebraska, and from a young age, he knew he would be rich.
I could figure out when I was 10, if I had a fairly long life, I was going to end up with a lot of money.
His name is synonymous with corporate titan.
He's an innovator. He's an icon. He's in the same category as the J.P. Morgans, the Rockefellers.
A pioneer who was instrumental in creating a $2.5 trillion industry.
Henry was ahead of everybody when it came to raising money. He sort of invented the business.
Rothschild is one of the most famous names in the world of finance. How do you modernize such a storied brand and its business?
I think since 2007, the banking industry has been severely disrupted, not only because of technology, interest rates, but I think there's a true issue of trust and meaning of banking.
Well, we've learned that we had too much leverage in the system, without any doubt, and that when you have leverage, bad things happen.
For most of his life, Warren Buffett has avoided the Wall Street ways of risky speculation, living and working in Omaha, where he was born in 1930, and where his obsession with all things financial began.
I knew I was going to be interested in stocks the rest of my life, but probably at the time I was, 8 or 9. I used to keep charts on all kinds of stocks when I was that age. My aunt gave me a world almanac, so I memorized the population of all cities of any real size. But I just like numbers. It was not limited to business numbers at all.
Buffett's ability to remember all those numbers would be the bedrock of his later success.
My grandfather had a grocery store, and I used to buy Coca-Cola from him in 6-packs for $0.25 and sell them for $0.05 each. I sold the Saturday Evening Post door to door. I sold Ladies' Home Journal. I had all kinds of little ventures, not all hugely successful, I might add. I liked doing business early on.
At 16, Buffett enrolled at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where he roomed with Charles Peterson.
Every day after class, I'd spend so many hours studying. Warren, on the contrary, picked up the books that were applicable to him and sat there and flipped through them page by page. And he might be through 2 or 3 courses in a couple weeks. He had a photographic mind. I did not.
Buffett also developed an early love of politics.
I was president of the Young Republicans Club at the University of Pennsylvania, and I even ran for delegate to the National Convention one time as a Republican.
After breezing through college, Buffett got a graduate degree from Columbia Business School. He then headed back to Omaha to start his own business.
He said, I'm going to form a partnership. And he said, would you want in? I said, sure, I do. There was only 7 or 8 people in that original partnership.
Convincing people beyond the first 7 investors got rockier.
My sales pitch wasn't very effective. I was 20 years old. I looked like I was about 16, and I probably behaved like I was about 12. So I would go around and call on people. They were always nice to me. But I would see a Mr. Smith, and I would go through all these facts and figures about why you should buy some stock. And when I got all through, in my head, I would count to 3. I would go 1, 2, 3, and then Mr. Smith would say, what does your dad think? And I would always want to hit him. But
it was frustrating. Buffett knew that he had to be a better salesman. So he turned to popular self-help guru Dale Carnegie.
Well, I had to be able to communicate with people better, and I mean in groups particularly. I just knew that I couldn't go through life terrified of public speaking, and I'd heard about the Dale Carnegie course. I mean, I proposed to my wife during the Dale Carnegie course, so I mean, I got my money's worth right during the course.
Buffett was finally ready to put his career in gear. He was picking stocks that others were ignoring, and his stocks kept going up. Little by little, word spread around Omaha that the kid knew what he was doing. In the first 5 years that Buffett was in business, the Dow rose by 74%, while Buffett's investments had gone up 250%. In 1961, at the age of 30, he reached millionaire status. But you couldn't tell that from the way the family lived. Their home, which Buffett still lives in, was bought over 50 years ago for $32,000. His children all went to public schools. Susie Buffett is the eldest of 3 Buffett children.
We grew up in a way that I think is probably different than most kids if you've got a dad who has what my dad has. I mean, we didn't get cars when we turned 16. We didn't live any differently, really, than most of the other kids we knew.
The biggest change in the Buffett household was that Warren was moving away from the staunch republicanism of his father.
Civil rights had the biggest effect on changing my views on politics. Neither party necessarily covered themselves with glory on it, but it was clear to me that a basic change, a really basic change in civil rights was called for, and the Democrats seemed to be much more attuned to that than the Republicans.
In his 30s, Warren Buffett wanted to find companies that he could buy a controlling interest in, and he found one 100 miles away in Beatrice, Nebraska.
Dempster Mill was a company that was really not doing very well. It was in the windmill business. Windmills now have come back, but it was not a good business to be in 50 years ago. But the stock was selling very cheap, so I started buying stock in that.
Former Wall Street analyst Alice Schroeder is the author of The Snowball, Buffett's authorized life story.
It was a business that had built up a lot of inventory that it didn't need, and it had a labor force that was too big. So it was a company that just needed to be downsized. And of course, the town that it was in was very small, and it was the main employer.
100 people lost their jobs, and Buffett took the heat.
What it taught Warren Buffett was that he did not want to get involved anymore in businesses that had labor problems, where he would have to fire people, where he would have to get involved personally in the management. He wanted somebody else to do that.
Buffett's next big investment also looked like a potential failure. It was a textile mill called Berkshire Hathaway, whose stock was selling for $7.50 a share.
We bought a textile company that was destined eventually to go out of business, just like every other New England textile company did. It was a mistake.
Glenn Tung is a managing partner for T2 Partners.
Berkshire Hathaway was not a good business. They didn't have a competitive advantage that allowed them to earn a sufficient return on the capital invested in the business. So while they were profitable to some extent, that profitability was inexorably being squeezed. When the cash was extracted out of Berkshire Hathaway, it was reinvested. First major reinvestment that was enormously profitable was the insurance business, and that drove everything that Berkshire Hathaway did from then on.
Andrew Fry is a reporter for Bloomberg News.
So he moved the company basically from textiles to insurance, and part of the reason was because the industry itself generated profits, but also because through the premiums that they gathered up from their policyholders, Buffett was able to take that and make his stock investments.
It's called the float. Money comes in interest-free from insurance premiums, which then gets invested in other businesses. Buffett also found a professional partner who was as market-savvy as he was, Charlie Munger, who was working as a lawyer when the two first met.
When I met Warren, he immediately started telling me how much better his way of making a living was than mine, and that I was too smart to stay in such a silly business as law practice when I could go into his business of running an investment partnership. And it took me about 2 or 3 years to realize he was right.
In the late 1960s, Wall Street was in the midst of an unprecedented boom. Stock prices were soaring as everyone rushed into the stock market. But for Buffett, it was time to get out.
I was running, it was a little over $100 million, and had a lot of happy partners, and I wrote them a letter and I said, you know, I don't know how to play in this game anymore. The valuations have gotten to where I can't find things. I terminated my partnership in 1969.
It seems counterintuitive, but Warren has always quoted Gus Levy, who said, "Be greedy when others are fearful, be fearful when others are greedy." And Warren knew that the party would come to an end and at some point the bubble would burst.
Buffett was 40 years old and was worth more than $25 million. But he was restless, and in 1973 made a fateful decision to buy into a California bank called Wesco. The problem was, Wesco was in the middle of a merger deal with another company.
And the next thing you know, the company that was going to buy Wesco complained to the Securities and Exchange Commission that Warren was trying to bust up their merger, which would have been illegal. And so an investigation launched.
The SEC went through every nook and cranny of Buffett's businesses, and what they saw alarmed them. Buffett and Munger's investments were a complex spiderweb of ownerships and cross-ownerships.
We had drifted in since we had several companies, so the whole thing looked like so much spaghetti that had been done for some evil master purpose.
We didn't feel we'd done anything improper, but there were a lot of rules, and the question was whether we'd violated any of them.
Stanley Sporkin was director of enforcement at the SEC.
Anytime you find that things are so wired that they take a long time to be able to understand them, raises a suspicion that maybe somebody is doing that to get away with something.
What also raised investigators' suspicions was that Munger and Buffett were offering Wesco shareholders a higher price for their stock than they could get on the open market.
So we just kept buying until our allotment ran out, at 2 or 3 points higher than we had to. Well, that was a very eccentric thing to do, but we thought it was the right way to behave, and the SEC went berserk.
Trying to head off disaster, Buffett's lawyer made an unorthodox appeal to Stanley Sporkin.
And saying, look, Stan, even though this doesn't look good from your standpoint, I want you to take into account the character of the individual. In my view, meaning Rickershauser view, he probably is going to be the #1 person in the financial services industry of all time.
The appeal worked. Buffett's company was fined just over $100,000, but no charges were filed against Buffett. In 1973, Berkshire Hathaway's stock price hit a new high of $93. Its profits driven mostly by their insurance businesses. Buffett also owned stakes in banks, clothing makers, and candy factories. But there was one business he was passionate about owning.
I love newspapers. I mean, I started reading newspapers. You know, my dad would bring them home when I don't know whether it was 6 or 7 or 8, and it was the first thing I'd grab. You know, my sisters would grab them too. We all liked to read it.
His first newspaper purchase was an Omaha weekly called The Sun. The paper won a Pulitzer Prize, a rare honor for a small publication. He then started acquiring stock in the Washington Post Company. The paper was struggling financially after the Watergate scandal.
1973, the stock had gone down a lot, partly in response to the fact that the Nixon administration had sort of declared war on the Washington Post. The interesting thing is when we were buying that stock at $20 a share, if you'd asked the people who were selling it to us how much the company was actually worth the businesses, they would have said $100 a share. But they sold it anyway. I salute the Nixon administration for stirring up the dust at that time.
Buffett's rule had always been to keep his distance from his company's managers and executives. But that was not the case at the Washington Post, where publisher Katharine Graham became his social partner and confidant.
She was in a business that fascinated me, so she would invite me to these various Washington parties, which were interesting. I saw parts of the world that I wouldn't have seen otherwise if we hadn't become friends.
But as Buffett's social circle widened, his wife Susie was feeling increasingly isolated back home and made a bold decision. She was not divorcing Warren, but she left Omaha for San Francisco to pursue a new life.
I get why she moved. My dad was getting more famous, and my mother was so not the Mrs. Warren Buffett type. Their relationship never changed at all. They were completely in love with each other. They talked 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. They traveled together. She just couldn't live here.
To make sure that Warren was taken care of in her absence, Susie turned to her friend, Astrid Menks. Within a few months, Astrid moved in.
It's very unorthodox. A lot of people, I'm sure, talked about it and had all kinds of lovely things to say about how weird it was. But I also think, you know what? It's nobody's business what goes on in somebody else's relationship. It worked for the three of them. It worked.
Buffett made history when he helped finance Capital City's takeover of the American Broadcasting Company, the biggest media deal to date. But his golden touch wouldn't be enough when Buffett invested $700 million in Salomon Brothers, at the time the nation's largest investment house. A few years after Buffett's initial investment, Salomon got into big trouble.
And it turned sour when I got a call in August of, I guess, 1991. They sort of hinted to me about the problems that were coming. A trader named Mosier had done some very bad things in the U.S. government bond market.
Those bad things included illegal moves by that Salomon trader to corner the bond market, by using unauthorized accounts to increase Salomon's share and force out their competitors. Derek Morn was a vice chairman at Salomon Brothers. Though he had no involvement in the scandal, he was appalled at what was happening.
To me, it was clear that we'd broken the law. We'd interfered with the workings of a critical market, and that the Treasury and the Fed would be less than amused.
As CEO of Salomon Brothers, John Goodfriend was taking the blame for the mess.
I remember it vividly. When you make the front page in the right-hand column of the New York Times and you picture that you're a fool, which I probably was, my disrepute became national. Should have been one of the worst days of my life, and probably was. I told Tom Strauss and John Meriwether that we had to go.
Talk on Wall Street that Salomon's top officials were offering to resign to prevent the firm's possible debarment as a primary dealer in Treasury securities.
Goodfriend made one last desperate attempt to salvage the company with a phone call to Omaha, Nebraska, asking Buffett to be the CEO.
And I wasn't involved in the thing so that I was not tainted. The hope was that I would be credible with all the people that were mad at us. There were a lot of them.
The crisis deepened when Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady ruled that Salomon was out of the bond business.
It was announced at about 10 in the morning on a Sunday. The U.S. Treasury had knocked us off the list of really acceptable people, primary dealers. That would have been a death blow to the company. So I had to get that changed by the time Tokyo opened.
That would have been a national calamity. And it looked for a long time as though the government was just going to say, the hell with you, Salomon.
Warren Buffett spent the entire day in frantic phone calls to Washington, trying to get the feds to back off.
I was scared stiff, and it probably came through in my voice. There were a lot of people that wanted us to go out of business over that weekend, and I didn't know what was going to happen.
At the 11th hour, Secretary Brady gave Salomon another chance. To seal the deal, Buffett had to personally take charge of cleaning up the mess at Salomon.
It was miserable. I was there 9 months and 4 days, and it's not an accident that I can tell you 20 years later exactly how long I was there. But it was important that it get done. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, and I wouldn't wish what happened to the firm, on anybody. But in a sense, I learned a lot.
Buffett emerged the hero.
Warren Buffett meeting with the financial community, signing autographs. They love him. The man with the squeaky clean image who's trying to clean up the mess at Salomon Brothers.
In 1993, Berkshire Hathaway stock hit $17,000 a share, and Buffett was world famous. But no amount of global traveling could change some of Buffett's ingrained habits.
Let's talk about Warren's diet. Here are the vegetables he'll eat. Corn on the cob, French fries, hash browns, and the fruit would be banana cream pie, strawberry shortcake. I think that's the end of the fruit. He also drinks, several cherry Cokes a day. I've never in my life, and I'm not kidding, seen the man drink a sip of water, ever.
The 1990s and 2000s would be the era of Berkshire Hathaway's greatest expansion. Brought into the corporate fold was the nation's biggest furniture store, a leading mobile home manufacturer, Fruit of the Loom underwear, Benjamin Moore paints, Dairy Queen, Geico Insurance. Over 70 companies in all, with a combined 250,000 employees. Some investments flew in the face of conventional wisdom. He bought his hometown newspaper, the Omaha World Herald, and he bought the Burlington Northern Railroad.
That is the thing that Warren Buffett has done over and over is he invests in something and then everybody looks at it and says, I saw it there. Why didn't I recognize these things all along?
In Omaha, Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting has become a place of pilgrimage for tens of thousands of shareholders.
It's really an amazing thing. The stadium is filled, and the spotlights are on a small folding table with two 80-year-olds at that table, and those two 80-year-olds have more stamina than anyone else in the room.
Hi.
He goes nonstop from Friday to Sunday night, and as the weekend goes on, he gets more energy. Can't explain it. It's got to be those burgers.
In the 2000s, Buffett was worth tens of billions of dollars, money he planned on giving away to a foundation to be run by his wife, Susie. But in 2004, Susie died of a stroke following cancer surgery.
It was a huge shock for all of us. My dad, I can't explain how much he loved her and how much he relied on her. I am going to start crying talking about this. He'll never totally get over it. None of us probably will, but she was really something very special.
2 years after his wife Susie's death, Buffett married Astrid Menks in a private ceremony. And he announced that he was pledging the bulk of his fortune not to his children, but to the foundation run by Bill and Melinda Gates. Bill Gates has been one of Buffett's closest friends since the early 1990s.
So it was, kind of phenomenal. It made us step up our ambition level, add a lot of things we wouldn't have been able to do. And so now every year, it's a gigantic gift that allows us to be double what we would have been without it.
Buffett's reputation was as much celebrity as brilliant businessman. When the U.S. economy plunged into crisis mode in 2008, Warren Buffett was again seen as a savior to many of the financial institutions collapsing under mountains of debt.
The Dow closed Monday's session down more than 500 points.
Warren Buffett is one enormous good housekeeping seal of approval. And if he's putting money into a situation, they're going to assume that he's intelligent enough to be making that investment because he thinks he's going to generate a satisfactory return off of it. And that will calm people's fears when fear is at its highest.
Among the businesses that received lifelines from Warren Buffett were Goldman Sachs, GE, and later, Bank of America. But as Buffett continues into his 80s, one question persists. Who will succeed this financial icon at the head of Berkshire Hathaway? A successor has been identified, but that name has not yet been made public. What he has made public are the political and economic causes that he feels passionate about.
I think in the last couple years, he has seen some places where he thinks if I open my mouth, it might make a difference.
What he's most vocal about is what he sees as the inequities of the tax system, something that's come to be known as the Buffett rule.
There's all kinds of ultra-rich who pay normal taxes, but there's a small segment, but you can find them very easily, who pay very low taxes, including me.
He considers himself, lucky to have been born in America at this time in history.
Well, I think he's one of the most memorable people I've ever met. He's touched a lot of lives with what he's done, and everybody that he's dealt with has made money doing it, and it's improved their life.
There are really no people like Warren where, we should sit back and benefit from the deep thinking he's done about business since he was very young.
I just have a great time every day. I am getting to do exactly what I want to do in life. It doesn't get any better than that.
Henry Kravis opened up a brand new frontier to investors, amassing a war chest greater than the gross domestic product of many small countries. To this day, he has rarely talked about his work or his life publicly and declined to participate in this program. Kravis was born in 1944 in the oil patch of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Black gold was everywhere. His father was a petroleum engineer who made his family a fortune. Alan Ace Greenberg, former chairman of Bear Stearns, has known Kravis for over 40 years.
There wasn't a major institution in this country that would make a loan against gas or oil reserves without speaking to his father first.
Brian Burrow is co-author of the landmark financial drama of modern business, the book Barbarians at the Gate.
From an early age, he clearly, as a man who had a very successful father, wanted to show that he was every bit as successful as his father was.
Kravis's road to success took him from prep school in the Northeast to Southern California in 1963. He majored in economics at Claremont McKenna College. In a recent commencement address to his alma mater, he shared how growing up in the 1960s helped shape the course of his life.
It was a decade of tumultuous social, political, economic, and cultural change. I understood that these rapid and disruptive changes could help me look at who I was and who I should become.
Kravis returned to the heart of the business world, New York. After an internship picking stocks at a money management firm, his father urged him to go back to school in 1967. He enrolled in Columbia's MBA program, but his focus was elsewhere.
He wanted to do deals. He wanted to make big bucks. Didn't want to stay at Columbia once he got there. It was only when his former boss allowed him to kind of keep his hand in the business in his spare time that Henry said, okay, I'll get the cotton picking degree.
After college, he jumped on an opportunity presented by his first cousin. George Roberts was an analyst at the trading shop Bear Stearns, but he wanted to move to San Francisco. Henry got his job. Louis Eisenberg is one of their oldest friends.
Henry and George are more than close. They can finish each other's sentences most of the time. I've heard them disagree, but they end up coming to virtually the same conclusions, and they both share the same brilliance for his business.
Though over 3,000 miles away, the cousins would work on the same team with their boss, a financial visionary, Jerry Kohlberg.
Henry Kravis's timing was amazing in that he lucked into a job with his fellow Jerry Kohlberg, who was doing these strange little deals no one had heard of called bootstrap deals, later to be known much better as leveraged buyouts.
Kohlberg saw opportunity where other investment bankers didn't.
Leveraged buyout is very simple. It's where a company buys itself. You strip them down of a lot of the excess. You make them lean and mean. You borrow a lot of money against the company's assets. To pay back that money, you generally sell off the assets.
He came up with the idea of going after family businesses. People that wanted to retire didn't necessarily want to sell out to their competition. People who were very concerned about the people that worked for them.
Their idea started paying off. Their acquisition of industrial parts company Incom International for nearly $92 million brought in the largest fee Kravis said Bear Stearns had ever seen, $950,000. Within 3 years, Kravis ran his own deals and became a Bear Stearns partner at 30 years old.
To make an LBO work, you can't have a trace of sentimentality. You have to be able to slash and burn. I would say Henry's skill set was ideally suited for LBOs. He has a very accomplished and cold analytical eye. Henry doesn't think anything of chopping down a CEO who doesn't deliver his numbers. Gone.
But an LBO's returns took years, a lifetime in the quick profit culture of Bear Stearns.
To say they had no patience with Jerry's deals is like saying that it tends to get hot in Texas in summer. It was a matter of time before things got ugly.
Bear Stearns management rejected Kohlberg's demands to start a separate LBO department. The three men quickly decided that their time at the legendary investment bank was over.
I felt very bad about it. I've often said that I don't think we worked hard enough to keep them all on. And I must say I've regretted it ever since.
I think it was difficult, as those kind of moves are, but Henry asks a lot of questions, and he asks himself a lot of questions, but there's very little self-doubt on the moves he makes.
In 1976, Henry Kravis, his cousin George Roberts, and their mentor Jerry Kohlberg took a huge gamble. In a bitter parting, they left the Wall Street powerhouse Bear Stearns.
We're going to start this, our own firm, and we're going to just focus on something that never been done before. It's at the time we called it bootstrap acquisitions. I really want to do it. I want to do it with George. We're going to go give it a try.
Armed only with their novel idea to make money and $400,000 from backers for overhead costs, on May 1st, Wall Street's newest private equity firm, KKR Investments, opened its doors. Kravis had to immediately convince potential investors and LBO targets that he could post big returns. Richard Beattie has been an advisor to Kravis since the early 1970s.
Most people would say, what? You want to put how much debt on this company? How can you do that?
Pointing to his success at Bear Stearns, he convinced investors to give him money. Jim Robinson, former chairman of American Express, has been friends with Kravis for over 30 years.
I met this bright young fellow who really was a very smart investment banker who was going into a new direction. That was exciting. A new way of using Wall Street, mobilizing capital to go into companies, to help build the companies into even stronger, better companies. Everything from the pension world to others who are interested in being limited partners.
Henry and his cousin George hunted for companies with predictable cash flow and potential for growth. Their approach was to try to work with existing management. Kravis wanted them on board for a smooth transition. John Mack is chairman of the board of Morgan Stanley and has known Henry Kravis for almost 20 years.
He's superb in delivering that speech, that talk, that vision, that story to a board. He comes across as knowing what he's talking about. Extremely professional. He'll know the facts, and he'll have a vision that he will lay out in front of the board and what he's thinking, why he's thinking it, and what the outcome will be.
He can be a force to be reckoned with in a deal, and you can see his emotion in it.
In 1979, KKR made its first major buy, auto parts maker Hyundai Industries. At the time, it was the first buyout of a major publicly held company in Wall Street history. But it would be only the first of many for Kravis, Kohlberg, and Roberts.
81, 82, 83 were terrific years, gave them credibility in the marketplace, gave them credibility with the banks, with insurance companies.
By 1983, KKR's 20% stake in each deal made Kravis a multi-millionaire. That same year, KKR was raising a record-setting investment fund, $1 billion. The innovative fund would come to intimidate their competitors. It was an era later summed up in one famously simple line in the movie Wall Street.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
And it was just getting started. In 1984, credit was easier to come by. High-risk, low-rated junk bonds became the vital engine for their LBOs.
Junk bonds, you could get them like that. The importance was the speed. It allowed Henry and George to move on a dime, overnight, to come up with the financing to make a deal work.
As new deals poured in, so did invitations to glamorous New York events. Kravis's second marriage to aspiring fashion designer Caroline Rome catapulted them onto the society pages. The couple often attended black tie events with their good friend, Donald Trump.
Henry was a very glamorous figure in those early days. He was a very, very basic guy with a brilliant mind, but he always seemed to be surrounded in glamorous settings.
Kravis was now a deep-pocketed pillar of the New York social elite.
Henry had no idea what the partnering with Caroline and the appearances in the social columns would bring. The world looked and saw a wealthy man. They saw overreaching, and these things became symbolic of the 80s. And Henry became symbolic of the 80s. He hated it, hated it, hated it.
By 1985, KKR and Henry Kravis personified the Wall Street boom. The private company was the most successful leveraged buyout firm in the world, managing an investment fund worth $1 billion. With their success came imitators.
Competition created an entirely new world for KKR. They could no longer take the time to sit back and smoke a pipe with George, the CEO, up in White Plains. Suddenly, deals had to be done fast or somebody else would be doing them. For the first time, Henry and George pushed KKR into competitive deals, unfriendly deals.
Unfriendly deals like Beatrice Foods, the parent company of some of America's best-known brands. In 1986, they took over the giant conglomerate for $6.2 billion, again setting records on Wall Street. KKR wasted no time in dismantling Beatrice, selling off division by division to pay down the debt. Kravis and his cousin did well. They earned $45 million in fees. Suddenly, with rich fees and rewards, came a split within KKR. Kravis and his mentor, Jerry Kohlberg, were in a battle for the soul of their company. On May 18, 1987, Jerry Kohlberg announced he was leaving KKR. In the press, he hinted at a decline of ethics at his former company, telling the New York Times he would stick with deals where reason still prevails.
Jerry's departure was very painful for all three. For everyone, it was a very sad thing when Jerry was basically shunted aside from the business that he'd founded. However, when that did happen, it left Henry and George in clear control.
Kravis and Roberts were exactly where they wanted to be, in clear control. But they swiftly hit a wall of trouble with Beatrice Foods. After stripping most of its assets to pay down the debt, KKR was still saddled with the company's bloated food division. Kravis hungered for a new blockbuster. In 1987, he found the perfect takeover candidate. RJR-Nabisco, the cookie and tobacco company, the U.S.'s 19th largest public corporation, had a stock price trading in the $40 range and would soon prove to be undervalued. RJR owned two giant businesses. A buyer could sell Nabisco to pay off debt and keep RJR's hugely profitable cigarette brands, Winston and Camel.
They have addicted customers, for Christ's sake. They make tons of cash. Everybody wanted to do that deal. And it had a CEO who would listen to just about anything.
Ross Johnson was very, very generous to people. He loved to provide an airplane for somebody to go to a golf tournament. Sometimes maybe he did too many things with RJR-Nabisco's assets, but he meant well.
F. Ross Johnson needed to boost his company's stagnant stock price after the Black Monday market crash of 1987 and problems with the company's new product.
Then there was the smokeless cigarette by R.J. Reynolds, years in the making. It hit the market with an enormous thud.
Nothing.
Going private with an LBO was his chance to revive the company, not to mention make a personal fortune. The stage was set. Henry Kravis wanted in. Kravis had approached Johnson with this very idea a year before, but there was a problem.
You'd have a hard time finding two corporate executives much different than Henry Kravis and Ross Johnson. Henry is tightly controlled and serious, and Ross comes across as anything but. In terms of personal style, he wears a little necklace and, he's like Dean Martin. They were destined to come into conflict.
Johnson and his management team decided to strike out on their own and partner with Shearson Lehman, an investment bank without KKR's experience in LBOs. On October 20th, 1988, they made a proposal, a $17 billion leveraged buyout of R.J. Reynolds. They were offering $75 a share, a nearly $20 increase over the stock price. Henry Kravis was outraged. The war had begun.
He was the king of that business at that point. And there is no denying that he was personally offended that a group of little upstart nobodies to the LBO business could think that they could come into his turf and take the single biggest deal ever proposed.
Johnson's group tried to make peace with Kravis, but talks went nowhere. Just 4 days later, Kravis and KKR shocked the financial world with their own bid, $20 billion, raising the price to $90 a share.
Henry's decision to enter the deal, as he did, it was not just big guns coming in. It was Godzilla wading in from the ocean and stomping down Wall Street. He wanted to scare off potential buyers.
Jim Robinson was head of American Express, the parent company of Shearson Lehman at the time.
I was on the other side of the fence. Henry and George, when they get personally involved in the deals, you know that you're dealing with a very capable adversary.
But the RJR board declined KKR's offer. While Johnson and his team were blindsided by Henry Kravis's aggressive move, they didn't back down. They countered with another offer of $92 a share, almost $21 billion.
Everything on Wall Street stopped. It was like two gunfighters out in the street, and everybody wanted to watch, or everybody wanted to grab a gun.
The media, they love a battle, they love a war, they love a winner, they love a loser.
The round-the-clock publicity and the scrutiny over the largest deal in history stung Kravis.
Nobody likes to see their deal negotiated in the press on a daily basis and be taken out of proportion.
When you play that game, you're going to get people taking shots at you. You're going to have people attack you. You learn to have a thick skin.
The RJR board also rejected Johnson's proposal. Though to move the deal forward, they told all potential bidders that they had 10 days to come up with another offer. The confrontation between the bidders escalated.
I think Henry might tell you today that part of what was driving him subconsciously was the desire to win, the single most deadly sin that you can have in the acquisitions business.
6 weeks after Johnson's initial offer for the giant company, Kravis and Roberts were locked in a marathon last-minute bidding session. Their final bid was a staggering $109 a share, nearly double its initial price. Now, it became a waiting game.
There's a lot of tension, and everybody's tired. I remember it was very late at night. When the board finally made its decision.
It's all over. It's all over? Right.
On November 29, 1988, a few minutes after 10 at night, the board of RJR had made their decision. Henry Kravis would win the day.
KKR are the best in the business, and they know what they're doing.
Johnson tried to engineer the biggest inside job in history. He would have made at least $100 million for his own personal bank account if the deal had worked. But a Wall Street tycoon named Henry Kravis snatched the company away, and that's it for Mr. Johnson.
KKR made $75 million in fees.
Clearly, winning RJR took Henry to the pinnacle of his reputation on Wall Street. But more than anything, I know from talking with him at the time that mostly what they felt was fear. Fear that they were not going to be able to make this work. Ultimately, those fears proved well-founded.
KKR were the winners in the epic business battle for RJR-Nabisco. But for Henry Kravis, the spoils were short-lived.
They ultimately won that prize. Over the long run, it did not turn out as well as one might have hoped.
The aftermath of the mega deal was catastrophic.
It had not worked out perfectly, and there was a lot of pressure to get this thing right and make a return for their investors.
The firm is often congratulated on making a large acquisition. And he's always said, save it, congratulate me when we get out.
In 1991, while trying to take RJR out of its tailspin, Kravis faced a family tragedy. Harrison, his 19-year-old son from a previous marriage, was killed in a car crash.
His life hasn't been simple. His personal life has had a strong sense of tragedy. Losing his son, you can try and imagine, but you can't really go there.
2 years later, Kravis was splashed all over the tabloids when he divorced his wife of 7 years, Carolyn Rome. He remarried Marie-Josée Drouin, a prominent economist and philanthropist. By 1995, cigarette price wars and tobacco litigation had crushed RJR's profits, generating a dismal annual rate of return of less than 1%. KKR decided it was no longer worth holding on to the corporate giant. They unloaded their investment, and one of Wall Street's most storied battles, the RJR-Nabisco buyout, came to a close.
You ask whether the RJR deal is Wall Street's finest hour. I don't think anybody would call it its finest hour. I think, if anything, someone argued that it was its worst hour, its lowest hour, its most demeaning hour, an hour when all the things, all the stereotypes that mainstream America believes about Wall Street, that it's doing things for ego and greed, seems so demonstrably true to the rest of the country.
After some rocky deals in the 90s, Kravis and KKR struggled. In 2001, one of their holdings, Regal Cinemas, went bankrupt, costing them $500 million. Bloodied but unbowed, Kravis admitted they needed to change the way they did business, and after years of rebuilding, were once again making headlines. In 2006, they bought the hospital chain HCA, valued at $33 billion. Jason Kelly is a private equity reporter at Bloomberg News.
KKR beat it with the HCA deal in 2006. Then KKR beat that record with the TXU deal in 2007. So they came back, and they came back fierce.
In 2007, they began a 3-year effort to list the company on the New York Stock Exchange, finally going public with a disappointing debut in 2010.
Going public is an extraordinarily difficult decision for these guys to make. What's uncomfortable for this firm that he and George have built over the years is showing any part of the secret sauce to the public.
KKR's portfolio includes 58 companies and manages assets totaling over $55 billion.
But even that doesn't quite capture the breadth of what they hold. $218 billion in revenue across the companies that they own, from toy retailers to power producers in Texas to hospital chains.
Look, there are two types of guys on Wall Street, those that retire to Florida and those that don't. Clearly, one of the things that's most important to him is legacy.
I don't think there's ever the expectation that every ball is going to be hit out of the park. But if there's a place that can hit every ball out of the park, he's developing a team with a deep bench at KKR, and they're going to hit a lot of balls out of the park.
If you've got a hope and a belief and a dream, follow it, no matter what.
Henry's an absolute pioneer. He's an innovator. He's an icon, like Morgan, like the Rockefellers.
Henry's a great guy with an unbelievable instinct for what's going to happen into the future. He can look and just see it better than almost everybody. And that's an awfully good trait when it comes to business.
What is good business? Ariane de Rothschild says it's all about striking a balance. Bigger isn't always better. You also have to be adaptable, sustainable, and stick to your values to succeed in the world of finance.
Did you like the challenge? Did you want to just make a difference? Dust off the brand?
I felt very strongly. One, I'm a banker. I really felt strongly about proving that you could be, there was so much bad sentiment about banking that I felt it's a pity. Banks are absolutely useful to the economy and should not be bashed. They slipped, yes, and I think it's a nice challenge to bring it back up and give them credibility.
How do you build a team around you?
So when I moved in, was the only woman. So on the board level, at the executive committee level. So one, really important, to rebalance. And it's not only to be politically in the quota section, but when you transform a company in depth, I really think you need very different talents around the table. I would say I think men think straight. We had the same result at the end, but women think in circles. And both, I think, was a very nice combination.
But how quickly were you able to change that, right?
So to be honest, the first year I was in shock because there was so much to do. And I'm not an operations expert, IT expert. So for me to change, it really required that I get to know these subjects well. Otherwise, you have no credibility. So went through all the IT, HR, operations, classical banking, private, the whole. So the first year was trying to find my way, getting the tone with my teams, building my teams, because I didn't have my teams. And then by the second year, really having the vision you have, but you need your teams around you to help you execute the vision.
So you've delisted now. How will you scale up the business?
So I think it's delisting was really I had it in mind for the last 5 years. I think it's a very strong signal that we as shareholders really believe in banking. Two, it gives us even more freedom to take the time to really make in-depth changes, because I think people tend to think that changes in a bank will happen in 3 years. I don't believe. I think, again, if you are changing in depth, it's a 7 to 10 year project.
Especially if it's culture.
Exactly.
Right, culture,
if you really are serious, again, many people talk about sustainability. All these subjects tend to think it goes fast. It's not true. They take a long time because you really want to make sure it's fully ingrained in the company. Gave me the flexibility to do that. And I think also very important, a lot of our clients are owners of their own companies, and they really like to talk peer-to-peer. And I think one of the challenges of banking, especially for high net worth individuals, is their dislike of banking. One, because basic services, they know how to do it themselves, so they are much more involved than many banks, but they still want to have this comfort zone where we peer-to-peer talk wealth, responsibility, investments outside the banking world. And two, they really require an alignment of interest, which when all the products we sell, I invest not only at the banking level, but me as a family as well.
What's your relationship like with Rothschild & Co.?
With my cousins?
Yeah. Is there confusion about who does what amongst your clients?
So I think overall there's an overall confusion, not only in banking, but overall a Rothschild is a Rothschild because there's so many and so many. I think the dispute or the settlement of the brand with my cousins, I think, was one very important. So we are clearly defining who is who and who does what. I don't think that confusion is healthy, especially in business. And I've always been clear, I think healthy competition is good. And I think in families, it's a very classical family, long families. It's one bump into a long story, and I think it's very good to be very precise about who does what. I think since 2007, the banking industry has been severely disrupted, not only because of technology, interest rates, but I think there's a true issue of trust and meaning of banking. It's been very disconnected. And I think a lot of the work I spent at the reshaping the bank, surprisingly, was a lot on culture, on values, on DNA, which at the beginning bankers looked at me and said, why is she talking to us about DNA? But it's really being very connected with your DNA, because you need a very strong vertebral column and sense of purpose.
So why this disconnect? What happened that there was this disconnect? I mean, is there a purpose that banks are meant to fill that they stopped filling?
I think partly. I think it's always the price of too big a success as well. And I think it's a natural human trait to keep going with the flow. And I think it was very important to re-question what was the purpose of banks and reconnect with what you would say real economy, real businesses, and not be such a high-level thinker, but rather on-the-ground doer.
And so what does that mean for your bank?
So it was really, again, I think one of the first speeches I had with the bankers is what it meant to be a Rothschild. Because even me, at the family level, I thought there was a disconnect between what they thought was or expected what was to be a Rothschild and actually. So one, it's really re-questioning your identity, your level. And identity is your level of service. How are you really connected to your clients? Most of our clients are entrepreneurs. multi-generational entrepreneurs. So I said to my bankers, if they don't think like entrepreneurs, it's really going to be difficult to be up to the level of our clients. And again, open their mind to other things than banking. So in our family, we do also more activities, vineyards, hotels, agroforestry. We have a very large activities, and a lot of the work was reconnecting all these businesses in terms of values and, again, sense of purpose. Why are we doing this?
But did you have to revive the Rothschild brand? Did it have a little bit of an older time image?
Very much so. So I think as well, part of, and I think there was a sense of entitlement, which I disapproved very much of. And I think probably it was easier for me to execute because I'm inside outside. Mm-hmm. And I've always said I did not grow up with this surroundings, so it was much easier for me to really challenge it deeply.
But talk to me about the day. So you say, actually, we need to shake up the brand, right? We need to make it more modern. How was that taken?
I think it wasn't clear what Rothschild meant. So I think, over time, there's so much myth and legacy and stories about the name that it was very important to be much clearer and do a clear separation between the family and the store and its history and the business.
But did you have grumbling? So you give that speech. And
oh yes, yeah. One, I think it's an interesting experience because it definitely was not expected that I would take over as a CEO. Yeah. Very strong preconceived ideas of the role of a woman, especially married to a Rothschild. So definitely not expected, not very welcome, to say the least. I think the level and the speed of work, I think there was a disconnect between my speed of work and theirs. So I think it was for them, that was a joke at the beginning, and I think after a few months they said maybe it's not going to be a joke after all.
So did you
the passion into which I was doing it? I think a lot of the themes I went into the bank really in depth. They were very surprised by probably a very hands-on approach at the beginning. The depth, the amount of hours. I think it's about average 17 hours a day. With children, with all the rest of the businesses to manage.
I mean, 17 hours a day, you don't get much sleep.
Not much.
Do you need sleep?
Not much.
Especially now when you're running a bank.
No.
Did they trust you after a while? What did it take for you to gain that trust?
I think you build trust. So it's really being committed to being there. I think after a year and a half, they said she's not going to give up. She really is very driven to bring us into change. And she's highly, highly passionate and determined. And I think a lot of the work was really getting the base of the bankers, because we always tend to focus on what is seen, but not the back end of the banking, which, by the way, as a bank cannot run with all the back offices. So when I moved in, was the only woman. So on the board level, at the executive committee level. So really important, to rebalance. And it's not only to be politically in the quota section, but when you transform a company in depth, I really think you need very different talents around the table. I would say I think men think straight. We had the same result at the end, but women think in circles. And both, I think, was a very nice combination.
But how quickly were you able to change that? Right? Finding,
so to be honest, the first year I was in shock because there was so much to do. And I'm not an operations expert, IT expert. So for me to change, it really required that I get to know these subjects well. Otherwise, you have no credibility. So went through all the IT, HR, operations, classical banking, private, the whole. So the first year was trying to find my way, getting the tone with my teams, building my teams, because I didn't have my teams. And then by the second year, really having the vision you have, but you need your teams around you to help you execute the vision.
So you've delisted now. How will you scale up the business?
So one, I think delisting was really I had it in mind for the last 5 years. I think it's a very strong signal that we as shareholders really believe in banking. Two, it gives us even more freedom to take the time to really make in-depth changes, because I think people tend to think that changes in a bank will happen in 3 years. I don't believe. I think, again, if you are changing in depth, it's a 7 to 10 year project.
Especially if it's culture.
Exactly.
Right, culture,
if you really are serious, again, many people talk about sustainability. All these subjects tend to think it goes fast. It's not true. They take a long time because you really want to make sure it's fully ingrained in the company. Gave me the flexibility to do that. And I think also very important, a lot of our clients are owners of their own companies, and they really like to talk peer-to-peer. And I think one of the challenges of banking, especially for high net worth individuals, is their dislike of banking. One, because basic services, they know how to do it themselves, so they are much more evolved than many banks, but they still want to have this comfort zone where we peer-to-peer talk wealth, responsibility, investments outside the banking world. And two, they really require an alignment of interest, which when all the products we sell, I invest not only at the banking level, but me as a family as well.
What's your relationship like with Rothschild & Co.?
With my cousins?
Yeah. Is there confusion about who does what amongst your clients?
So I think overall there's an overall confusion, not only in banking, but overall a Rothschild is a Rothschild because there's so many and so many. I think the dispute or the settlement of the brand with my cousins, I think, was one very important. So we are clearly defining who is who and who does what. I don't think that confusion is healthy, especially in business. And I've always been clear, I think healthy competition is good. And I think in families, it's a very classical family, long families. It's one bump into a long story, and I think it's very good to be very precise about who does what.
Ariane de Rothschild manages a diverse portfolio. So, what leadership skills does it take to seamlessly switch from the boardroom to the vineyard? It's not all about finance for the Rothschilds. They also run a hospitality business, wineries, many concentrated in the Bordeaux region, as well as philanthropic programs across the globe. What kind of leadership skills does it take to manage such a diverse organization?
Do you like finding these little jewels that have been forgotten to try and revive them?
I like transforming businesses. No, and
you've always loved that.
Yes, I love transforming business, and I love building. So I think in building, also literally building square meters. So, but Caron, I think one incredible history. 1904, one of really the very beautiful maison de parfum. Outstanding. I mean, really classic, high-end perfume. With dates, with really true stories, I think really authentic, true stories with really complex formulas. And I think it's an interesting business to revamp. Again, going back to the completely run
in
down.
France, maybe people remember
really
it.
French, no. And it was very big in the United States. In the 30s, was really a reference perfume. And I think it's really fun to, again, rebuild the business, go back to its DNA. Because if you don't know the DNA of Caron, you can launch perfumes, but you're... and I think Caron, by the way, because it's small, we can really work sustainability and environment. So we're doing a lot of work on, or thinking on the packaging. because packaging in the luxury business is a true issue.
In terms of recycling or sustainability?
Recycling, not having all the paper and and I think really going back to the original perfumes. To have a mythical perfume, I think there's one every 10 years that really comes out, a mythical.
But why do you like transforming instead of starting a new company?
We do both.
Yeah, but what do you prefer?
I think Caron deserves to exist again. I think it was a pity to see a brand that is dying. It was literally dying. It's one of the few left, really, in France, and it really was a nice challenge. I think it's not my field of expertise, so I enjoy very much learning. So my learning curve in the perfume business is not. I think it's also for me very great satisfaction to keep learning businesses that I don't master. And then on the building side, yes, I like to build as well. Generally, I build also for my teams because I really like to re-challenge them. So typically in the wine business, one of the reasons why the wine in Spain I did separate from my teams, it was my project, completely outside the wine business, was to re-challenge them on what they thought was working well. So I said, I'll do my own.
In terms of type of wine?
In terms of type of wine,
selling markets,
speed of doing it, execution, quality, because many times your teams, you can discuss it and rediscuss it or impose it, but if you don't set yourself the tone and the standards.
I mean, you also have a sailing, right? Because of all these different, I don't know what you want to call them, either units or portfolios, is it to build a business that hedges itself, or is it just doing things that you're passionate about, that you like?
So I have inherited, there's a legacy. So I inherited a big portfolio of activities. So one is managing them, getting them to the next generation. Of course, if they're really disastrous loss-making, I take my losses. But I think one of my role is to transform them and bring them to the next generation. Another activities such as sailing, it's a mix of, I think the family has been sailing for more than 140 years. So it's really being this connection between being connected to your DNA, your tradition, your passion. I love sailing as well. And taking this to another level. So this boat in particular, I think is going to write new pages of sailing. One, because of the materials used, the speed it's reaching. It's now going more than 47 knots, which is unheard of for flying. And there was a little twist where we worked with a street artist, because for me it also meant reconnecting, not being just this precious family with a street artist from California.
I mean, where do you have the most fun? When you look at what you do day in and out, right, sailing, is there something that you think, actually, I really love this in my 17-hour?
No, what I like is switching from one to the other. I think my greatest pleasure is on-off, so the elasticity you need, and that's what I'm trying to share with my bankers, is to be. I think it pushes you to always be curious of what's going around you, and the world is moving very fast, and you need to be very flexible, very flexible.
But can you learn that, or
yes,
are you born that way?
I learned it. I wasn't born. I was born. I lived in Africa, so I learned it, and I think it's. I think the brain is the most elastic muscle we have, so you can. The more you do, the more your brain works well.
So you were raised a little bit everywhere. How has that influenced the person you've become?
Well, I think growing up between I'm half French, half German, but never lived before 18 in Europe. Lived in between South America and Africa. I think one, it's this appetite of the world, so I'm true love for the world, and two, I think kept a very strong connection to real life. So again, pre-2007, I was very concerned about what the financial industry, where it was heading. I think partly is because I have by education, this balance between very basic life and a very sophisticated life. And that's the elastic part. So many businesses go from sailing to perfume, banking, wine. For me, it's a fantastic luxury intellectually.
But would you describe yourself as a globalist? Because you've been raised everywhere, and is there a backlash against, people that are seen as globalists?
There is a backlash, definitely. Most definitely. I think there's a misunderstanding of what globalist is. So I've always viewed it as a privilege. Every country I go, I learn. It has a lot to give. And I think, yes, the backlash is definitely lack of, it's due also to economic pressures, but a lot also lack of education or understanding and lack of long-term view. So what we're living today, the rise of nationalism, is also a reaction to human flows that, by the way, I don't think you will address by raising walls. I think you will address them by being concerned about these countries. So typically Africa, which is a continent I stay very connected to, we invest a lot in small and medium-sized companies, not just because it's good business, but also because I feel it's our responsibility to try to contribute to stabilizing these countries in a non-political or non-raw material approach.
Which would be what, with microfinancing or?
We a company mostly invest in small, medium-sized companies, consumer goods, financial services, and health.
Does it make a difference if it's female-led or not in emerging markets, or not necessarily?
They're all family businesses.
Family businesses.
So they're really male, female, they're really strong families and so we not only invest, but we accompany them in governance, structuring the companies, and it's twofold. It's not only business, it's because I feel strongly about helping Africa with what I know how to do.
Talk to me about the person you admire the most.
The person I admire the most is Muhammad Ali. When I moved to the Congo, to DRC, he had just had the fight with the famous rumble in the jungle. So I grew up with this expression that was Ali Bomaye, which means Ali kill him. One, I think greatest fighter of all times, activist. So his positions were very outspoken. I think his search for identity, religious and roots. And I loved, I admire his fights, and a fantastic tactician. So he's really a source of inspiration. So I have a big book of his fight in Congo.
So if you're having a bad day, is there something that, do you think about I don't know if it's advice or something that you read about that?
Yeah, I like his fights. So, no, it's true, so either I always said some of his fights, by the way, I think are very interesting because he naturally did what The Art of War, the book, is talking about. So spontaneously, he was such a clever tactician, so his famous technique of rope-a-dope, etc., I think is valid in business as well. Some of the businesses you are competing, you're fighting, so it's not a linear trend. You have to have tactics.
In 2008, the biggest concern was that banks were too big to fail. Governments felt they had no choice but to prop them up or risk major meltdown. Jump to 2010 and enter Philipp Hildebrand. Former economist, hedge fund manager, and central banker, he was ready to take on the lenders, strongly advocating stricter capital requirements. Today, on Leaders with Lacroix, we meet one of the most recognized names in Swiss banking. He's now vice chairman at BlackRock, the world's biggest money manager, which handles more than $5 trillion in assets.
10 years on from the financial crisis, what have we learned?
Well, we've learned that we had too much leverage in the system, without any doubt. And that when you have leverage, bad things happen. And not only do they happen, but when they happen, the effects tend to be amplified. So I think that's the key takeaway from it all. I think we've also learned that this notion of kind of letting the market be totally free, that governments really should get out of the way, that wasn't a very good idea. Yeah, I think what stands out is banks needed much, much more capital than they had at the time. We had capital levels that were excessively low. I mean, in some cases, these banks were leveraged, nearly 100 times. And that, to me, has always been the key takeaway. In fact, in some ways, I wish we had focused more on the capital issue and less on all the many other things that have kind of made it into the regulatory reform realm.
But is there a concern now that we're over-regulating the kind of the seeds of the last financial crisis and that we miss the next one?
There is always a bit of that. I think we shouldn't have any illusions. Financial crises will not disappear from the pages of future history books. So we have to be realistic. I don't think we're over-regulating. I mean, I think it's sensible to sort of say, let's take stock and pause, and that's very much happening. Certainly when you look at what's happening in the U.S. now, that is part of the story. That's not a bad thing. See how the system settles. As I said, unfortunately, in many ways, we had too many regulatory initiatives, and it's the multitude of these and how they dynamically interact that is very complicated to predict. So I think a sense of a sort of pause, a deliberate pause, is not a bad thing. But I wouldn't say that that the system is today over-regulated.
You love history. How does that taint your view of the world?
For one thing, the unexpected will always happen sooner or later. I think that history tells you that. And we're not very good at predicting it. And so what we have to think about is, how do we build a system? How do we ensure that the system is resilient when bad things happen, rather than, getting into this control mindset that you can somehow eliminate all risks?
Where do you see the biggest disruption coming from in the next 5 to 10 years? Is it industries or is it actually China?
I think it's probably technology on the whole, certainly in our industry. But even if you ask me kind of more broadly, technology, the way it will impact people's behavior, the way it will impact democracies, frankly, the way it's impacting media right now. You're in the midst of this, so you know this better than anybody. I think technology is all pervasive in many ways.
Is it impacting inflation? Is that why inflation is so tricky to find?
First of all, central banking has something to do with this. There is a framework around central banking that basically emerged firmly in the mid-90s, let's say, that price stability can be maintained, can be guaranteed. That has impacted expectations of economic agents, so that's certainly part of it. The kind of innovation around central banking, I think, is important. Secondly, globalization has dampened kind of wage pressure. There's no question about that you constantly have new pools of labor that are entering the global labor market, the global supply chains, and so that has certainly made it very difficult suddenly to have a kind of wage spiral going on. And then technology certainly is another piece where the combination of technology, competition, and integration of new economies, of new spaces, new pools of labor, has made it difficult indeed for inflation to behave the way it would have behaved in the 60s or 70s.
So should we still look at the Phillips curve? I can't make, is it broken or is it dead?
Well, I think maybe that's the wrong question to ask when you kind of ask it bluntly like that. It's more about how do we think these forces, will evolve over time. And I think it is true that prices behave differently today than they did some decades ago. And probably that will not change. So I think we do have, the good news here is we have an environment where we probably don't face imminent inflationary pressures, or even risks for that matter. Having said that, it still remains true that monetary policy has to be there as the kind of guarantor. And so I would very much hope that even if we don't get any inflation for the next years or perhaps decades, that central banks can continue to play the role they play in terms of maintaining that price stability, because it's a very precious thing to have price stability.
But should we worry more about deflation, or is it just a lack of inflation?
My sense is that we have managed to sort of kill the deflationary psychology, in a sense, for the time being. And that's one of the reasons why as we speak today, the global outlook looks pretty positive, because in a sense we have managed to reverse that fear about deflation, and that's largely, frankly, due to, again, very aggressive, very courageous central banking, which has had some negative side effects, but I think on the whole has been the right policy.
What do you see being the side effects of this ultra-loose monetary policy?
It's essentially very low interest rates, potentially for a long time to come. And then the question is, how will that impact savers? Retirement is a big, big issue. When I look at BlackRock, 2/3 of our assets are basically tied to retirement. The question of how you finance your retirement in a world of potentially protracted low interest rates is a big, big problem, a difficult challenge that I think most of our societies today face. And frankly, in most countries, government's policy hasn't really responded, hasn't even in many cases sort of openly acknowledged this challenge, that we have a major retirement problem facing us. And low interest rates don't help, in the sense that if you start to think that I'm not going to be able to live on my retirement savings because interest rates are low, that might just lead you to save even more. So this, what's called the precautionary savings effect, is something that is potentially very destabilizing. And the longer we have very low interest rates, coupled with this demographic challenge, the more I would be worried about that. And I certainly sense, as we talk to our clients worldwide, that retirement is probably one of the biggest issues we face. And we have to make sure that we don't get into a situation where this becomes a crisis.
As a hedge fund manager, Philipp Hildebrand made his mark amongst the Swiss elite, but his ambitions ran higher. By the age of 46, he joined the ranks of the Central Bankers Club, becoming the youngest president of the SNB. His term ended just 2 years later, when a trading scandal involving his then wife led to his resignation. The Bank of England's Mervyn King said, "We all know that he is a man of total integrity, extraordinary ability, and most important of all, courage. Such people are rare. His country will miss him." Hildebrand believes strong leadership is having the courage to act in the face of adversity.
When you were head of the SNB, what was your decisive moment?
In my time, we had two, I would say. One was the rescue of UBS, which was a very difficult moment because in many ways, it went against everything we believed in, and yet we knew we needed to do it. We also knew that it would create tremendous anger in the population. That was clear, and of course it's turned out that way at a global level, and that it would take a long time for banking to redeem itself. So we knew the consequences were in many ways very significant, and yet we had deep conviction that at that moment we had no choice but to proceed. The other one obviously was the introduction of the minimum rate.
On UBS, was there a very difficult day? Do you remember some of the conversations that you had at the time where you realized that actually something had to be done which would have been unpopular?
We had done a lot of simulations of what a rescue might look like. We had engaged with the bank at the time to study some swap operations. We never told them that we would be prepared to actually buy the assets or take them over. So we were well prepared, but the actual moment I remember very well was a breakfast at my apartment actually at the time in Zurich, when the CEO and the chairman came by and basically told, Thomas Jordan was there at the time, myself, and the head regulator, and they told us that they now needed help. And that was a very clear, decisive moment. From then on, kind of the plan went into action. And that was a tough moment because we knew that, we had to do it, but we also knew that it would be a grave thing to do in many ways.
And talk to me about the capping of the franc to the euro. Again, were there other possible scenarios, and why did you go for that one in the end?
We had, again, this had been building up for weeks, if not months. So we had time to look at many different scenarios. We also had history. The SNB, of course, the country has faced similar circumstances in the past, and we also had a great team. We brought in not just the board, but I also brought in quite a few of the experts, the economists, to really work out every possible angle. We worked through every possible scenario, And so by the time we triggered it, I felt that we had done all the possible preparation we could have done as an institution.
That at the time was quite a big risk. Or are you a risk taker by nature because of your also previous life as a hedge fund manager?
I don't think it comes from there. One of my mentors told me early on and taught me early on that sometimes not acting is the greatest risk. So with the markets being what they are, we had to come in very suddenly and very aggressively, which we did. But the reality is behind this, there was nothing reckless about this. There was due consideration and extensive studying and scenario analysis.
It was bold, right?
It was reasonably bold. It was also very important that it had the credibility of the community of central banks and even governments to some extent. That in many ways was my biggest worry, that we would be seen by some of our principal partners worldwide as doing something that wasn't quite right. And one of the things that I spend an enormous amount of time on is really to make sure that the analytics behind it were robust, that this would not be seen as some kind of beggar thy neighbor policy, that we had to explain to our colleagues the peculiarities of Switzerland being very open with a kind of safe haven problem in the middle of Europe without being part of Europe. So all these dimensions were incredibly important.
So did you confide in any other central bankers?
That's a delicate question. What I would say is that one of the unique things about central banking, and it's certainly one of my greatest privileges that I've experienced professionally to have experienced this, is the collegiality and the trust that develops in the central banking community. Being part of the club of governors is a great privilege. You really have a community of colleagues that you can trust. There's a way you can learn from each other. You can discuss complex issues that is quite unique, and to me was one of the greatest privileges really of being part of that club.
What was it like the day that the franc capping was, announced not to be holding to the euro anymore? What did it feel like?
This was never premised to be forever. It was not a permanent change of the monetary policy regime. So the fact that it would be at some point that it would come to an end was always obvious, and as it was obvious that it had to be premised on Europe somehow not falling apart.
Will Europe stay together?
Yes.
You're a firm European believer.
Yes, look, we have, in this world of globalization, I think the only way for Europe to be influential today is to have a strong common voice.
Philipp, when you decided to resign, how difficult a decision was that? That was January 9th, 2012.
It was tough. I was I love being a central banker. Serving the central bank, my country, is certainly the greatest privilege I've ever had professionally. But ultimately, public service is not about yourself. It's about the institution you serve, the people you serve, or the country you serve. And in that context, it was the right decision because it needed, the circumstances were such that credibility was of the utmost importance, and the best way to preserve the full range of action for the central bank in a difficult environment. Remember, this was still more or less the tail end of the crisis. Things were still very uncertain. The euro crisis was still in full bloom. It was very, very important that there were no questions around the leadership. So it was the right thing to do for the institution. It was the right thing to do for the country. It was a painful thing to do for me.
After leaving the Swiss National Bank, Philipp Hildebrand went to work for Larry Fink, whose reputation precedes him. The founder and chief executive of BlackRock is resolute, has high expectations, and is larger than life. His company manages more than $5 trillion in assets, making him one of the most influential figures in the financial world.
Philipp, what's it like working with Larry Fink?
Oh, there's a good question. Yeah. Larry is a bit older than me, and I try to keep fit, but traveling with him is a workout.
Is he demanding?
He's demanding, yes. He's demanding, but no more demanding than he is on himself. He has coined this phrase that we all have to be students of the market, that there's no excuse for anybody at BlackRock not to be a daily student of the market. And I think that shapes the culture very much at BlackRock. This relentless kind of never be satisfied, always remember that the world moves on. You have to continue to learn every single day. So we have a lot of initiatives around internal programs and academy where we really force everybody and encourage everybody to kind of live that motto. And if people can't do that or don't want to do that, then they're in the wrong place at BlackRock. So the culture that he carries very much runs throughout the firm.
What's the question you get asked the most internally and by your clients?
Well, you often get asked, what's it like to work with Larry? So, but I think on substance, for a long time, since the crisis, it was about the future of Europe. And then I'd say the other question is, how do we operate in this low interest rate environment, particularly if you extend it for a long time? I mean, what we believe is that we are in a sustained recovery at the moment, but we also think that, we will see a kind of cap on interest rates and probably growth rates, that we are structurally in a lower real rate environment and a lower growth environment going forward for quite some time.
So how does BlackRock deal with it?
First of all, we have to be relentless students of the market. We invest a lot of resources and time into building out our BlackRock Investment Institute, in providing insights to our clients. We've done a lot of work around the implications of kind of lower interest rates for longer. We have found new ways to share our analysis with our clients on a permanent basis. And then, of course, we have to just be innovative around using technology, around new products, about product innovation.
Are you a fintech company or are you an asset manager?
It's a very good question. We're certainly an asset manager, but I think we're more than an asset manager. I believe that we are a platform in many ways. And in fact, we have said publicly that our ambition would be that 5 years from now, we would have a third of our earnings derived from kind of technology-empowered or technology-driven products and services.
Talk to me in kind of, real terms. What's a robot advisor? And who's going to, am I going to have a robot as a boss at any point if I work for BlackRock?
No, I think the answer is you will have lots of interface, or if you're maybe not as a client, we don't go directly to clients at the moment, but through our distributors, they will have tools, technology tools that will make it much easier for them to deal with their clients, work with their clients, and bring value to their clients. And we want to be that platform for our distributors. You will also see that in your products, that the combination of technology-driven investments and sort of human-driven investments will increasingly be visible. So I think this whole distinction of sort of saying, we have technology and then we have people, I suspect that's not going to be the world we live in 10, 15 years from now, that the reality is there will still be important roles to play by people. Analysis, judgment, learning about the markets, experience, history, all these things will continue to be important. But our people will be empowered by technology in many ways, hopefully to the benefit of our clients.
You definitely have an advantage because of size and scope. Do you believe there'll be more consolidation amongst your competitors?
Look, I think there will be a lot of companies that will disappear. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a lot of M&A. Some of these companies may simply not be worth buying. So the clients will simply migrate away from these companies and buy other products from a different company. So it doesn't necessarily mean consolidation in the sense of the kind of corporate idea, but I do think that we're going to see a lot of change in the asset management industry. And those companies that cannot respond to the need to change will simply disappear. You have to remember that it's a very easy thing for a client to change his or her asset manager.
Outside of work, there's a passion for sport. In his youth, Hildebrand was a swimmer and narrowly missed qualifying for the 1984 Olympics. These days, he's a keen cyclist, skier, and an avid rock climber. It offers an escape from the demands of his day job. He says drawing parallels between sport and business can also help you develop skills as a leader.
I think what it teaches you, hopefully, is discipline and stamina and sort of staying on top of things. And every day. It's not just about a great effort today and then I slack off. So, and it never ends. It's sort of this this ability, this mindset of saying that you never really win. You just kind of go to the next challenge. I think that's so heavily embodied in our own culture of BlackRock at the very top through Larry himself, as we talked about it. So in that sense, there is a kind of analogy. But there are certainly many great leaders. Yeah,
what do you swim and you rock
Well,
climb?
now I climb, I ski, I spend a lot of time in the mountains. I like to bike.
Is that when you think about the world?
It's more when I kind of don't do anything else than climbing. I mean, the beauty about climbing is you don't have a lot of time to, it's almost a form of meditation. It's, in a sense, you don't think about anything other than the next step. And I find that to be a very refreshing exercise in a world where you're constantly being bombarded normally and every day, another email, another message, another call.
What part of history fascinates you the most? And are there parallels? Is there, I don't know if it's Tudor England or anything that you see with parallels that we're living through today?
We can learn a tremendous amount from history, from the mistakes that have been made in European history. Europe has terrible, terrible incidents. And I think repeatedly to kind of learn about that, to teach our children. We recently took all our kids to Auschwitz as a way to kind of make sure that this historical sense of how things can go wrong in Europe is very important to pass on.
Is there a shortcoming in human nature that frustrates you when you do business?
I struggle when people don't have a framework on how they think. I find it very important for people to develop an ability to think about a problem, no matter what the problem is, in a reasonably disciplined way. I think sort of erratic thinking tends to lead to erratic outcomes.
Philip, final question. Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I used to be with a couple of others, Mark Carney, and we used to always be the youngest in the room. I now notice, I told Larry recently about the last year or so when I'm standing in the elevator on the way up here in London or in New York in our offices, I'm beginning to realize I'm kind of amongst the oldest. So I'm beginning to think about that. I can certainly imagine being at BlackRock. I think we have a tremendous 5 years ahead of us in terms of change, challenges. And other than that, I've learned in life you have to be prepared for surprises and then react accordingly. But I can certainly imagine still being at BlackRock talking to you about how things have changed 5 years from now in asset management.